Okay, so we're going to be discussing food sovereignty. And to begin the discussion about food sovereignty, we're going to look at different food movements, and we're going to actually contextualize how to build food sovereignty, but then kind of contextualize it within its historical uh, context also, basically, as to how food sovereignty came about and what issues are being addressed through looking at food through the lens of food sovereignty, basically looking beyond just sustainability and food security, but actually building conditions so that people have the ability to produce their own food in their own localities. So one of the major concerns about food, stemming from after the World Wars, was really about the food supply. And I've talked about this in other courses or other classes here, is that there was a push towards what they called the Green Revolution. So the idea here is that there are starving and malnourished people across the world, and what we need to do is we need to feed these people. And in order to feed them, what we need to do is increase the food supply. And this was the kind of train of thought coming out of the Food and Agriculture Organization, and a lot of the world players were discussing issues with malnourishment and basically how to feed the world. So people from the Green Revolution propagated this idea that what we need to do is just keep on increasing food supply, and if we have more food in supply, well, then eventually we're going to be able to feed the whole world. And what we start to realize, actually, and especially in the conversations about food sovereignty, is in order for certain localities to be able to be food secure, they can't just rely on basically increasing mechanization or getting GMO seeds, because that actually doesn't do what they need to. It actually exacerbates certain problems, as well as they need to control their own food supplies within their own localities, because if they're getting other farmers or other kind of food from different countries dumped cheaply into their environments, is that they will not be able to have a sustainable farming culture, or basically they won't have their farmers that will be able to be able to make ends meet in agriculture. Therefore, basically what is being advocated is that in order to have food security, we need to have nations be able to control their own food supplies, be able to control food production, and not necessarily just get cheap commodities dumped into their economies. So the discussion around food security has been going on for quite a long time. The UN has looked at definitions of food security and basically how to make the world more food secure by providing access to food. So if we look at the kind of first definitions here, we're looking at availability of, at all times, of adequate world food supplies of basic foodstuffs to sustain the expansion of food consumption, to offset the fluctuations in production and prices. So basically, what are they saying here is that we actually need to be able to have adequate supplies of food to people throughout the world, regardless of production and regardless of prices. And as time went on, the definition of food security became a little bit more in depth, but also more connected to people's cultural dietary needs and other things in order to have an active lifestyle. So here you're going to see the definition of food security changes. So looking at food security at an individual, household, national, regional, and global level, when it's achieved, all people at all times have the physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious foods to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active, healthy life. And also in 1996, this definition was proposed at the World Food Summit in Rome, where actually there was kind of a counter definition proposed also. So a group called La Via Campesina were pushing for the idea of food sovereignty, because what they were saying is, and actually especially this group here comes out of Mexico, where a lot of the cheap commodity foods from Canada and the United States and from other parts of the world were being dumped into Mexico. So this caused problems in the food economy, is that the farmers were basically being undercut, and they weren't necessarily, it's very difficult to sustain a farm when other countries are dumping cheap commodities into your economy. So basically the definition proposed by Via Campesina went just beyond providing food and having food access to actually being able to control the mechanisms of actually producing food and basically producing for their own localities. So it's not just about meeting the dietary needs and meeting availability, but it's actually giving people control over how they produce food within their own local environment. So food security has kind of shifted definitions over time, but really looks at access to food and looking at nutritious content of food and dietary needs to have an active and healthy life. But pushing the boundaries of this is that we also need to look at challenging certain aspects of our food economy, especially global food trade and other things that are preventing access to food. So at the World Food Summit, the Via de Campesina proposed different positions and basically said, well, look, food security is important, but in order for us to achieve food security, we actually have to have food sovereignty. So we actually need to control our food supplies and production, but we also need all these other elements in there as well. So they talked about right to produce and access land. So in order to produce food, you need a place, arable land to grow food. And when land is being commodified, then actually people don't necessarily have access to these lands to grow on. So basically a lot of rich farms are buying up certain agricultural lands and basically are monopolizing on these lands and growing food as food commodities. But people, part of the peasants, indigenous movements, and other movements, part of La Via de Campesina and throughout the world were looking at actually rights to reproduce themselves through land access. So basically having more of a common land access, or basically having government land that is restricted for growing, or other things that are basically will bring land out of the commodification process so that actually people could use this and farm on the lands. So the other aspect that they brought in over and above food security is that food is a basic human right. So it's something that's not necessarily a commodity, but it's something that everybody should have access to regardless of their financial situation, regardless of where they are in the world. And being a human right basically means that people should have access to food regardless of their circumstances. They also discussed agrarian reform because some of the issues that were discussed is basically issues that pertain to colonialism. And the indigenous people in lands in Mexico and other places in the world don't have access to their lands. So the idea of agrarian reform is basically providing access to land to the people and kind of protecting the resources of this land. So protecting natural resources, protecting the waters, protecting the air, and protecting other things as well, so that the land could flourish and not necessarily be robbed of its nutrients or clear cut in ways that actually are devastating to the land. They talk about reorganization of food trade. So basically there's that food should not, the conditions that were being brought up through Via de Campesina, is that food should not be just something that's put onto the market. It shouldn't be something that the global north is going to subsidize so that they could have cheap food commodities that they're selling to the rest of the world. But basically reorganizing food trade in it that it's actually more localized, but also more in the realm of social economy, where basically people are producing for their local environments and they're producing for the good of the community rather than just to actually make money off of this. The other condition that they describe is social peace, that people should have the ability to lead conditions of nonviolence in their lives and not necessarily be in kind of war scenarios or other things, especially if it's imposed on them, because of other countries coming in and imposing either war sanctions or, other forms also, which we can see in the global south. And the other aspect that we're discussing is democratic control of the food system. So is that people should have the impetus to be able to be involved in their food system, take part, actually become active consumers, but also become producers and be able to decide what kind of food is being produced in their local environments, and actually have the farmers basically produce that and take part in the production themselves. So this goes beyond just providing access to people and basically roots itself into addressing more of the system problems with food, things that are actually rooted into the food systems themselves. Because it sounds good when people say, well, we are going to subsidize food and then we're going to provide other countries with cheap food. It sounds great, in practice or in theory, but when you actually get down to what that really means, is that actually people sometimes lose the ability to then have local food production and stay competitive to people like Canada and the United States that are heavily subsidizing their food economies. So basically, within the food sovereignty approach is we're looking at addressing systemic issues and actually changing political and social conditions and economic conditions, and not necessarily just kind of put these band-aid reforms of giving people access to food by dumping cheap commodities or by providing charity. So this really changes the process and basically roots people into a larger approach of being connected to food rather than just relying on the world players to provide it for us. Now, there are a lot of issues with defining food sovereignty because food sovereignty is overdefined, but it's also, depending on the needs of the communities that are discussing it, comes to life in different ways. So basically, depending on the time and space that discussions orient around food sovereignty, is that we could actually have different ways of manifesting food sovereignty. There are some kind of key parts of the definition, but as we'll see is that it's actually quite complex. So there's overlapping definitions and basically there's different ways of understanding how food sovereignty looks in different parts of the world. So basically some of the concepts that broadly define it are things about food politics, agroecology, land reform, pastoralism, fisheries, biofuel, GMOs, urban gardening, patenting of life forms, labor migration, feeding cities, feeding communities, state policies, public health, climate change. All of these things fit into the rubric of food sovereignty, okay? But not one of them necessarily defines food sovereignty on its own. There's an interesting article here by Darren Quailman that looks at actually farming industries in Canada. And actually, we're going to touch on this article at another point in more detail, basically looking at how difficult it is to do farming in Canada and to be profitable because of the way that the food industry works, especially when it comes to seed and chemical companies who are kind of usurping most of the profits when in Canada. But Quailman actually puts together an interesting perspective saying, well, it's really difficult to define food sovereignty, but it's easier to define what food sovereignty is not. And actually kind of looking at the flip side, we can see some of the presentation of his arguments here. So food sovereignty is not just a set of policies simplistically aiming at maximizing production and exports. It's not a disregard for the destruction of family farms and rural communities. It's not a push towards high input, high cost, high energy use model for food production. It's not a concentration of land ownership into the hands of few. It's not a corporate takeover in a growing number of agricultural sectors. It's not a push towards massive production units that concentrate potential pollutants. It's not a transfer of key food processing facilities to foreign companies and foreign lands. It's not economic policies that make foreign-based transnationals the primary beneficiaries of the wealth created by family farms. It's not a system that makes citizens more dependent on the food supply that comes from further from their home. So you can see some of the issues that are being discussed here, and it's very hard to come up with like just a one overall definition of food sovereignty, but there are multiple ways to define it and ways to see, you know, especially kind of defining what it's not or what are the issues that are being addressed. But nonetheless, we're going to make an attempt to define food sovereignty. And I guess some of the spin that I put on it here is I like to describe it as a process. So it's a movement, it's a struggle for democratic processes that are perpetually in negotiation and always in motion. So what does that mean is basically is that a process of obtaining food sovereignty is not just about the outcome, is that, yay, we're food sovereign and that's it, but actually goes beyond that and is actually continuously a negotiation about the democratic processes and different things that are outcomes that people want to see in a food sovereign nation or a food sovereign community. So basically what it means is that in order to continuously strive towards food sovereignty is that you have to have meetings with your localities, with your food producers, with the consumers, and then set values that people want to see within the food system. And then hopefully struggle to meet the values and to then become more food sovereign in the process. So food sovereignty is also about outcomes. So agreed upon declaration of rights, codes of ethics and guiding principles. And some of these are debated at different conferences, meetings, and public forums, carried out by different parties and local communities. We're going to actually look at the Nalene Declaration in 2007 as one of the larger declarations of food sovereignty. So food sovereignty talks about outcomes, but basically in order to even discuss food sovereignty is that people need to have the right to have rights, because you can't even then have, you know, food sovereign rights if you don't have the ability to actually have rights in the first place. So food sovereignty is not just about food reform, but it's actually reforming people's ability to participate in local politics and local economy as well. So one of the bigger aspects here is that food sovereignty refers to the rights of nations and people to control their own food economy, to decide how food is produced, consumed, processed, and distributed. Food sovereignty is referred to as a paradigm, a trend, a framework, a discourse, a regime, and a model. So what does that mean? Is that actually we can look at different frameworks of food sovereignty and compare them with other frameworks also. And some of the readings that is actually the case is that we're actually looking at food sovereign frameworks and kind of comparing them to the corporate neoliberal framework also. So I'm going to introduce you to some of these frameworks, and actually a couple of them that I'll introduce today go a little bit over and beyond what you read for the class today, but hopefully we'll get you to understand how to compare and contrast these different frameworks. So it's also inherently a multidisciplinary concept. So, you know, a lot of people that have written about food sovereignty come from different sectors or from different areas of academia. You know, it actually refers to largely a peasant movement and a farmer's movement, but actually also touches upon food consumption and other things as well. So academics have taken the notion of food sovereignty and then discussed that in other realms like food sovereign communities, or myself actually in my thesis I'm looking at food sovereign campuses. So how do we actually develop food sovereignty frameworks within a campus of a university? So kind of touching upon what I've discussed already is that there's more of kind of a larger, more formal definition that does go into the stuff that I've already discussed. So I'm not going to read this for you here, but Arrow for Change provided a definition of food sovereignty, and you can actually read through this as well as look at some of the other ones that we're discussing in the class also, but I'm just kind of providing you more of a context here. I guess one thing that is important here is, and actually also discussed by the Via de Campesina, food sovereignty is an essential prerequisite for food security. Basically, the idea here at Via de Campesina is they say that in order for us to have food security in different regions of the world, we actually have to be food sovereign or we're not going to be food secure. So we could see some of the definitions that are being described here. The Via de Campesina, the long-term food security depends on those who produce food and care for the natural environment, the stewards of food-producing resources. We hold the following principles as necessary for achieving food security. Food is a basic human right. This can only be realized in a system where food sovereignty is guaranteed. The food sovereignty is the right of each nation to maintain and develop its own capacity to produce its basic foods, respecting the cultural and productive diversity. We have the right to produce our own food in our own territory. Food sovereignty is a precondition to genuine food security. So you could see actually this is a statement made at the conference in Rome where food security was being discussed, and this idea, the notion of food sovereignty was actually put forth by La Via de Campesina. So you could also see other definitions actually quite similar as well by the People's Food Sovereign Network. So I'm not going to go over all of these definitions, but you can see some general themes in it is that it's about not just catering to the neoliberal capitalist policies, but actually the right for people to control their own food economies and you know, be able to do so in regions across the world, to be self-reliant and not just kind of the beneficiaries of charities or food dumping. I'm going to present to you also a framework to look at food sovereignty versus other frameworks also. And this is Eric Holt Gimenez, and we're going to read one of his books near the end of this course. But just to kind of introduce you to these ideas is there's different ways of seeing how to improve the world here. The idea basically is, you know, how do we improve our food conditions, and what are the institutions, especially in this chart right here, that are doing that? So, you know, there are different kind of forms of politics in this. You have the neoliberal version, you have the reformist understanding, you have more progressive and radical food movements. So basically, if we're going to kind of deconstruct the neoliberal ideas, is that, you know, people coming from the neoliberal approach don't really believe that there's an issue with food. So the idea here is that we need to feed the world by actually increasing the production from the people that produce food in the large context. So basically it means to empower the large corporations to produce as much food as possible, because if they could do that, then the idea is that this will kind of trickle down to people that are starving. You know, what we realize actually, especially through the Green Revolution, is that this approach didn't function. There are still, close to 1 billion people that are starving throughout the world presently. I think the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that there's about 800 to 900 million people starving. So, giving the ability for neoliberal politics and for these large corporations to be able to produce more in the food system is not the way to feed the world, and actually exacerbates certain problems. The reformist, basically the food security model, looks at also increasing production, but then taking this production and then kind of giving it as charity to other people throughout the world. So basically looking at where there's starving people, or looking at where there's malnourished people, and then kind of using overproduction in order to use or to provide charity to people in need. So here in the food security idea is that, yes, there are issues that are being recognized, and usually the biggest issue that's being recognized is in the way of producing food to feed the world. However, it's not necessarily anything to kind of challenge the world institutions in the larger context, basically just to kind of reform the system and to make sure that food producers are also going to be charitable and to kind of give parts of their food to people in need. So this is the corporate food regime. There's a difference between the neoliberal and the reformist, in that the reformists do understand that there's issues, especially when it comes to providing food to feed the world, but basically don't kind of want to rock or change the larger structure of our neoliberal environment. There's other perspectives also. So we have more of a progressive and radical perspective that falls under what they call the food movements. Okay, so looking at food justice, we're looking at alternative, fair trade, slow food, or other things that are based in community food security movements. So kind of linking with farmers into CSA baskets, addressing social justice movements, and actually addressing conditions of labor. Okay, so here basically there's a recognition that we need to make changes, and a lot of time the changes basically are in the way of alternative food institutions or other things that are basically going to address the problems in ways that provide alternatives, but are not necessarily, well, I guess looking for structural changes, but not necessarily addressing it in the conditions that they're putting forward. The more radical approach actually addresses these concerns of bigger picture or more systemic problems by actually going and trying to change the way that the political economy works and other things as well. Basically, there's a recognition that global food capitalism doesn't function presently. There's a breakdown of distribution across the world to the extent that a lot of these players that are making lots of money are not feeding the world right now. So basically the idea here is that the core problem is that the capitalist food organization, or basically food capitalism, is rotten from the core, and this needs to change. And in order to then have better food environments and to be food secure, is we have to recognize the right of food and the right of people to have land to grow food as well. So basically it's looking at kind of larger contexts and more justice in reforming not just the food system, but the capitalist system also. So I've kind of described this also, and you can take a look at this in more detail on your own, but different models that will go into understanding how these frameworks function. So we have kind of the corporate framework, like I was saying, is all about producing more and unregulating markets so that neoliberal politics could actually be at the forefront of food production. So these are people that are in denial that there's an issue and basically think that the only way to feed the world is actually increasing production. So basically what is the approach here is unregulate markets, expand GMOs, and basically kind of have more intensive production by using technologies and other things as well. So we have more of the development model, so looking at sustainable development, and we looked at that last class, is basically dividing sustainable development usually looks at the kind of the three pillars, so looking at the economy, the social, and the environment. And like I was saying, that there's a better way to look at this is more of the embedded model. But anyhow, so the development approach is more looking at, how do we provide food and how do we provide subsidies, and, how do we actually provide food through more market-led endeavors and, providing charities and other things for people that are malnourished. Then there's more of the empowerment aspect. And basically the idea here is that, yes, people need to control their food, but they need to do this locally. So basically creating new business models that will impact the community in positive ways. provide better wages, have more of a solidarity economy, have access to land, have more rights to food, and taking control of local production through mechanisms of social economy. And the other approach basically is kind of more rooted in the food sovereignty aspect, but basically the idea is here we need to dismantle corporate power. We need to dismantle these food monopolies that are taking place. We need to have more redistributive land reform, more community rights to water, to seeds, to other things to reproduce ourselves. So as you can see, through the entitlement framework is that, it's not just about creating these little pockets, but actually changing our conditions of political and economic understandings and practices when it comes to our production of food. So this is Eric Holt-Gimenez, and we're going to see actually that a lot of these discussions reproduce in other academic forms also. So Hannah Whitman wrote another article that actually looks at very similar approaches as Eric Holt-Gimenez, basically looking at empowering people through different rights and being able to give people rights in order for them to reproduce their own food. So here she talks about agrarian reform, shift to agroecological production, or gender equality, protection of intellectual and indigenous rights also. And basically against being against trade liberalization, rethinking land and nature, also about agrarian land reform, unity and diversity, empowering different genders. Right now, women are the ones that are the main producers of food throughout the world, and this is not well recognized. But also, food, also speaks volumes as to contains elements of class and ideology and all of these other things through the productive mechanisms. Certain people will eat very high class foods because they're kind of more part of a bourgeois entourage. And most people throughout the world won't be able to do those things also. So basically understanding this unity and diversity. And basically kind of the advocating for more of a community-driven research and emerging future directions in research. So not necessarily just kind of studying food and how to improve GMO technologies, but actually looking at what communities need and how do we actually use communities as a starting point to understand better food systems. So if we look at Hannah Whitman, she looks at the different issues that are being defined through these different frameworks. So basically here she'll differentiate between the corporate neoliberal framework and the food sovereignty regime. And basically these two frameworks will orient people towards different solutions to looking at these different problems. So, how would a corporate neoliberal framework look at feeding the world? Basically is about increasing production. So making things more intensive, more mechanized. And if we're actually looking at food sovereignty, it's more about food access, food security, prioritizing local agricultural production and local markets, and basically prevent dumping of food. So basically providing very cheap food commodities into locations that will actually devastate their local economies. So basically the role of agriculture. So basically here it's about increasing exports if we're looking at the corporate neoliberal model. So, increasing the exports, making food more available through production, but doesn't necessarily look as much about distribution. So here, looking at the role of agriculture from food sovereignty frameworks, we see the role of agriculture is more diversified and basically is into improving the national well-being of people. Basically making a healthy environment by relocalizing things. And having more fair trade as well, so that the farmers themselves are actually paid adequate wages and are able to having living wages. So the role of advancing technology in the corporate neoliberal model is looking at increasing technology, increasing mechanization, increasing ways of intensification, and basically kind of like pest and disease control using inputs like herbicides, pesticides, and using GMO technologies. But the other way is looking at food sovereignty approaches. So empowering food farmers to become more efficient and competitive through diversification of production. So alternative technologies, things that are not necessarily so cost intense, things that are actually able to be done in a more holistic approach. So looking more at agroecology or other mechanisms of food production that will use kind of more of the natural environment and be able to reproduce through things that are more natural to the world rather than just putting in these external inputs. And then environmental stewardship, basically that there's protected areas that are regulated, and then, kind of restricting access to people. But if we're actually looking at the food sovereign regime, we're looking at reintegrating people's idea of environment and agriculture back into kind of the conditions of land reform. So giving people the ability to reproduce themselves, through different ways of obtaining agricultural territories that are not necessarily just mutually exclusive to really large farmers. So this is some of what's been described by Hannah Whitman, but you'll see actually this touches upon in one of the articles that I had you read also for today. In 2007, there was a major push to develop new understandings about food sovereignty, and there was a conference in Nelene discussing the principles of food sovereignty, and there was about 500 delegates that attended this. Even the Farmers Union in Canada attended, and other delegates throughout the world, and basically concentrated on figuring out what food sovereignty means, and then basically taking these understandings and bringing them into their different regions in the world and putting them in practice in the way that they see appropriate. So basically some of the values that were brought up is focus on food for people. So it's not just food for exports or for selling, but actually food to nourish the population and local environments. Values for food providers. Basically the idea is that there are a bunch of people throughout the world that are subsistence farmers that are having trouble making their livelihoods off farming. And if you look at Darren Quailman's article in more detail, the one that I described above, he actually deconstructs the profitability of farming in Canada, and basically in the aggregate throughout, I forget how long he looked at this, but anyhow, the companies that are making the majority of the profits are the large agrochemical and seed companies, and actually leaving a lot of the family farms making close to $0 in profit, because they have to invest into all these technologies, GMO seeds, and all of these other things. So the external inputs provide it so that it's very, very difficult to be profitable as a farmer, and not even just profitable, but actually even make your daily subsistence or to subsist as a farmer. So another thing is to localize food systems. To look at where food could be produced and prioritize things that can be produced locally. They didn't necessarily rule out any kind of food trade, but what they're saying is that localization is better, especially, if we could produce certain foods in local environments, we should rely more on our local networks. Also puts the food control locally. So it's not just relying on these external companies to come in and produce food for us, or be able to, get those kind of foods that are supermarkets because they've been imported from different places throughout the world. But basically we need to control our own food production locally. And that's very important, especially in the global south, where a lot of farmers have been devastated by food dumping, cheap commodities coming into their food economies. Also build knowledge and skills. So some of the knowledge that's been lost is a lot of the indigenous knowledge. Through colonialism, there's been basically a lot of the knowledge of how to respect nature, how to live in symbiotic relation with nature, is not necessarily in the forefront of our scientific understanding. Today's science is actually about manipulating the environment to become more efficient for us, so that we could have higher production yields and be more profitable. But a lot of the First Nations in Canada or other indigenous cultures was actually more about kind of being in a symbiotic relationship with nature and using things that are necessary, but giving back to the land and protecting the land, and realizing that we're actually one with nature. People are not separated from nature, although we may think we are. Our natural environments also provide conditions for our sustainability of ourselves, and basically works with nature, so that we should be using production techniques and tools that are based in how nature actually responds in ways that are helpful and not harmful. So we don't need to use very large dumps of nitrogen onto farms in order to produce farms, but we could actually have crop rotations, and we could integrate animals into grazing pastures, and the animals will aerate the land by walking on it and kind of making the soil a little bit more fertile, but then also pooping on it And this becomes then part of the compost, or reproduces or replenishes some of the nutrients back into the soil. And in agroecology, you'll do crop rotations and animal rotations, and basically this is one way to make your soil more fertile. In places like factory farming or intensive farming, is that a lot of the time the farmers are actually dumping nitrogen or other very heavy chemicals into their land, and or concentrating the amount of waste that's coming out, especially in factory farming, where these animals are producing methane gas and large quantities of poop. And this is put into the natural environment in ways that are quite harmful. Nitrogen actually dumped from farms, or basically the farm runoffs that farms especially that are using high amounts of chemical nitrogen, this is quite polluting. And what you'll see is actually the farm runoffs sometimes run into waterways or other places in the world, and basically cause devastations. Basically what they call dead zones is a very high concentration of nitrogen in certain parts of the water where no living forms will be able to live. So these are very destructive farming mechanisms. And the food sovereignty approach is to actually build a symbiotic relation with nature, by reconnecting with indigenous knowledge, localizing food systems, understanding food's value over market values, and basically focusing on food for people and not just for the sake of selling through commodities. The other chapter that I had you read was looking at alternative food initiatives. So you'll see actually especially in Montreal, there's a whole variety of local food initiatives or alternative food initiatives. So when we say alternative, we're usually referring to alternative, basically looking at more things that are connected to the community, things that don't necessarily follow the capitalist model of food, things that deviate from neoliberal models of food. So, there are different definitions and there's different ways of understanding this, depending, what kind of food initiative we're describing altogether. There's one actually in Pointe St. Charles that is a really great example, a food organization called Le Détour. And they built their model off of the Park Slope Food Co-op model in New York, where basically people will contribute a certain amount of labor into the organization in order to drive down the costs for the members. So I don't know exactly how much labor it is offhand, but I think it's about 2 hours of labor per month that people will participate in at Le Détour. And basically from that, they get a membership and they're able to get cheaper food commodities because of their active engagement and actually reproducing some of the labor that's necessary for the operations. And actually just reading about this recently, now they have more of a productive aspect. I saw that they're building a greenhouse, or have built a greenhouse, and have some outdoor food production, basically some raised bed gardens and things like that as well. So these are alternative food initiatives. Although they still have some elements of markets in it, they are not necessarily looking for being as profitable as possible. They're looking at connecting foodscapes back to their local environments. So that's just one initiative. There's a whole bunch of different initiatives that exist. You're probably aware of other ones also. So alternative food initiatives are deviating from just being profitable and actually putting in different values, and usually addressing specific values depending on what the alternative food initiative is. So a lot of these initiatives are actually addressing community food security. So we have these community food centers across the world that are looking at approaches that are not necessarily just about food security, but connecting local people to local food environments and empowering them through more of a food sovereignty-based approach. So there's food community centers throughout Canada, and one of them is actually an NDG called the Food Depot. So you could actually check it out by clicking on this link if you want, but I would highly suggest people getting or going to visit them online, or finding out what they're up to, because they're a really wonderful organization also based in NDG in Montreal. The other thing too is looking at more collaborative approaches, or networking these alternative food initiatives becomes a more important way of actually connecting things in the bigger picture. So some of the challenges that we're going to be describing in a little bit more detail later on, but is that if you have kind of a one-off alternative food initiative, it doesn't really root itself too much into changing the bigger picture of food. So it's very difficult to address, corporate food monopolies or all of these things on a one-off. What we need is we need to have collaborative food networks. So basically organizations that are working together in tandem throughout different areas of Canada or the world, or in our local communities even, that are actually looking at different aspects of improving our foodscape. So, it could be anything from food production, distribution, waste management, providing different ways of consuming food. But the idea here is basically if we have collaborative approaches and create networks, then it becomes more resilient and more robust. Through the article that I had you read about these different collaborative food networks, they basically described different contexts in Canada where there was an attempt to do so, and different organizations that actually still exist today that are actually looking at more of kind of collaborative approaches. So they were saying basically in the article is, before kind of the 1970s, 1980s, there was a lot of issues that were being addressed in food, but a lot of the time this was looking at very specific things like looking at fisheries or, looking at pollution or other things that were coming out of issues with our food system. There was a bunch of provincial networks and organizations that were developed in the late 1998 onwards. And these provincial organizations were looking more at collaborative approaches, but looking at kind of more provincial-based food context and trying to collaborate with each other in the bigger process, but really looking at more kind of localized food production within the different provinces. And in the early 2000s, there was a push towards actually kind of having more of a pan-Canadian or a larger food association that actually looked at food security across Canada. So in 2004, there was a conference in Winnipeg, the National Food Assembly, where different academics and different food practitioners got together and then stated a need for more of a national food basis, which then basically spun out two organizations. So the Canadian Association for Food Studies was developed in 2005, and a group called Food Security Canada was developed in 2006. So Food Secure Canada looks at food security across Canada, but not just from a food security context, looking kind of more rooting into areas of food sovereignty and empowerment of local food communities, and basically do a whole bunch of different endeavors. I've shared some of them on the Facebook group with you. Right now, they're actually looking more at kind of political economy and addressing large systemic processes in the food system. So addressing structural racism in our food system, looking at conditions of migrant laborers, looking at conditions of people working in the global south that are producing food for us. They're also looking at other issues when it comes to availability of food to people and decommodifying food, basically challenging GMOs and challenging this kind of intensification or mechanistic intensification of food, as well as they're looking at kind of basic human rights, because you can't look at being food secure without addressing some of these systemic problems, like basically getting people adequate amounts of money to participate in their food environments. So basically kind of looking at basic income packages or other things that will give people the right to food, because for people to have access to food, especially under capitalism, is that they need to usually purchase food off of markets or be able to have food banks or other things like that. So looking beyond just providing food as a charity, Food Secure Canada is looking at actually rooting other larger elements like basic income and addressing social issues and social justice issues into having better conditions in society for us all, and then with that having better food conditions also. So I would highly suggest you get in touch, look at some of these groups. You can participate with them when if you want to. Some of them, I guess, it's more difficult than others because some are more national based. But you can look at Le Détour that I was telling you in Pointe St. Charles, or the Depot. And we're going to look at other examples as well going forward. So basically, some of the challenges to the collaborative food networks or this approach is that it doesn't always adequately address social justice. So people that are looking specifically at addressing or improving foodscapes, we have to realize that social justice issues are at the forefront of why people are food insecure. There is not equal access to meaningful employment or getting different salaries or better salaries, I guess, for everybody. So there is inequality, social inequality, there's economic inequality, and all of these different things prevent people from having equal access or adequate access to food. So one of the challenges, basically, how do we address social justice and root this into our understanding of food security and food sovereignty? Also, is that there's an over focus on consumer-based solutions. So yes, alternative food initiatives are wonderful, but if we're looking at kind of this idea of voting with our dollars, this is not always the way that we could address these large structural issues. So companies adapt, and they kind of provide these charity-based approaches to make them look really good. And it's very difficult sometimes to see what companies are actually beneficial for our food environments or our local environments and which ones aren't. Just a couple examples is that you might have some fair trade coffee, locally based, that are doing either direct trade or fair trade and actually providing better labor conditions for people in the global south, but might be very expensive, might not cater to local communities, might be more of kind of like a bourgeois solution, kind of catering to the rich class in Canada or local environments. So that doesn't always amount to larger system changes. The idea basically is that we need to root our understanding of change and improvement in our local food systems to things that also address the larger issues, things that will actually challenge food monopolies, challenge the political and economic structures that are currently problematic in the larger picture. So not just about voting with their dollars and becoming better food consumers, but also challenging the big dominant food players also. Okay, so I provided a link to the Nalini Declaration, and actually this is from an article by Raj Patel. I highly suggest you look at this, and if we have time today, we're going to go over it. But basically, the declaration goes over different aspects of what different people are fighting for throughout the world, and basically the people at the Nalini conference signed off onto these different values that basically they're projecting. So what they're fighting for, what they're fighting against, and what they're doing to improve local foodscapes and foodscapes in the bigger picture also. I also provided some links to find out more about food sovereignty. So you could actually visit the website of La Via Campesina. You could look at the Nalini newsletter, People's Coalition for Food Sovereignty, International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty. I highly suggest you look at some of these models, groups, and different discussions that are taking place around food sovereignty. Because if we actually truly want to develop food security, and if we actually want to have a sustainable foodscape throughout the world and in local environments, we should start embracing ideas that are being brought forward in regards to food sovereignty.